Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Ruben Kronig of Vineyard Time on Martha's Vineyard. And today I'd like to talk about the Rolex Submariner, specifically the Gold Submariner. The Submariner has long been a part of diving culture and a part of collecting culture. But when the Gold Submariner was launched in 1969, it was very distinctive and it was very different. At this point, the Submariner was a dive watch. It was a tool watch, and gold was predominantly reserved for dress watches. So the idea of making a solid gold dive watch was very different, and no one quite knew how the market would perceive it. But if the test of time is any indication, it was a great decision, because Rolex still produces a gold Submariner today. Though the original Rolex 1680 gold Submariners are very sought after and very different from our contemporary gold Submariners, there is a lot of similarities between those early gold subs and the contemporary subs we see today. Those first subs have some interesting features, and it's important to understand some of those subtle differences and some of those similarities, both if you're deciding to collect them or if you're just deciding to buy one to wear, because different versions are either more wearable or less wearable, might be better for collecting or worse for collecting. So understanding those little variations is important. The first gold Submariners were launched with a black dial. That's one of the most distinctive features that you'll see. And shortly thereafter, it was released in the blue dial. The blue dial, in many cases, is considered a more desirable variant. That said, they're both very collected. The third variant that isn't an official variant, but is definitely broadly collected, is a tropical dial. A tropical dial is when the original paints and finishes of the dial have faded, changed to an interesting pattern or to a slightly different color. For instance, a blue dial fading to a purple dial, or a blue dial changing into a brown dial. And those variants that give individual Rolexes distinct character have been widely sought after in the market. But when you're looking at what was actually produced from the factory, the first gold Rolex Submariners, there's some distinctive variables from the outside of the case that change later. So first off, you'll notice that there's a big, thick acrylic crystal. That's one of the most distinctive features on those early Submariners. Then you'll notice when you look at the dial that it has a nipple dial. The nipple dial is a little different than later dials. Nipple dials are characterized by markers at the 1 through the 12 that are domed balls of gold, and they have little luminous dots in the center. That's what's known as a nipple dial. The next thing you'll notice on the dial is that the earlier Rolex Submariners in gold have a 200-meter water rating. That changed later on. Then when you're holding the Submariner, you'll notice a few more differences. You'll notice that the bracelet is actually a hollow link, meaning that it's folded metal and it's hollow inside versus a solid link. Then when you're setting the watch, you'll notice that the original ones are not a quick set function. You actually need to run the hands around and around and around to change the date. That's how the early ones were. It's a little bit trickier than when you're looking at a slightly later one where it has a quick set movement. The next variable to be looking at is the bezel. The bezel on those early ones were friction fit. Now, how does that change a little bit as time goes on? As you're moving into the late 70s, going into the early 80s, you see some transitional models in the early 80s that still have nipple dials, but have a higher water resistancy rating. So instead of being the 200-meter rating that you see on the early ones, it changed to a 300-meter rating. Then you see some more distinctive changes. First off, you see the nipple dial disappearing. You'll notice that on the later versions of those watches, the markers are flat gold dots with a bigger luminous pad on the dot. You'll also notice that the bezel clicks. It actually ratchets in place. That was a big advancement because it allowed you to be more specific when you were diving about how many minutes you had been under. And it had a nice distinctive feel to it. And that's really, really nice. The next thing you'll notice is that Rolex made their movement a quick set movement. This was a game changer. The ability to pull out the crown and just change the date and run it forward a little is really, really useful. Then the bracelet. That was another big distinction. The bracelets on the next generation of Rolex, the 16808, they're solid link. And that is really nice. It means you have a heavier, chunkier bracelet that's a lot more durable. The next distinction that's really worth looking at is the shallower crystal. They transitioned from that thick domed acrylic crystal to a sapphire crystal. The sapphire crystal is harder to scratch, but it still provided a lot of that water resistance rating that they needed. So those were some pretty good changes. And you'll notice as you look at the Gold Submariner and its evolution, it continues to evolve. One of the biggest distinctions with the newest Submariners is that the newest Submariners have a thicker case and they have the oyster lock buckle. So instead of being a buckle that is a sheet of gold that's actually formed as the buckle, they have a buckle that is much more mechanical, much more robust, much more durable. It is quite nice. Then the ceramic bezel, the thicker case. Interestingly enough, when you're looking at the Gold Submariner, you'll notice that one of the things that has remained constant is the diameter. It has been 40 millimeters since the first Gold Submariner to the contemporary Gold Submariner. And that's one of those interesting commonalities. So one person might ask, well, why would I buy the earlier ones if the later versions of the Submariner actually have some innovations that are more durable, make the watch more robust, make it more wearable, more user-friendly? And it's a really good question. And the first part of that answer is, it depends what you want the watch for. If you're looking to buy the Gold Submariner to be your tool watch or to be your dress watch, then a lot of the newer versions are going to offer some of those features that you're probably going to appreciate. If you're looking at the Gold Submariner as a part of your collection, something distinctive, those different variations represent intriguing elements to collect. The earliest ones are the rarest ones, and that's something special because it gives you something different to talk about, something different to wear. And when you look at it and you look down, you have that pride of ownership of knowing that you have something that has a history, something that was used, something that was enjoyed for a very long time before you owned it. And you get to look at some of those subtle details and the evolution of the model. And that's something really, really special for those of us who love vintage watches. But that's why I said it really depends what you're wanting, whether you want to buy those late 1960s, early 70s Submariners, or whether you want something from the 80s and 90s that's going to be a bit more refined with the sapphire crystal, the quick set movement, the solid bracelet, or something like what you can offer today, which has all of those variables and then some. An even more robust case, a ceramic bezel instead of the aluminum bezel insert. That ceramic bezel insert is a game changer. It is really, really lovely. That said, if you're gonna collect the vintage Rolexes, one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of these watches have lived their day. And that means not that they don't have a lot more days to live, but they've had a lot of experiences. And so you need to watch out when you're buying them to make sure you're buying what you think you're buying. One of the things that's happened in the Rolex watch market is that watches have been pieced together. They've been Frankenstein. Another thing that's happened in the Rolex watch market is that they've been over-serviced, meaning the case may have been over-polished, meaning that the case may have been poorly polished. Or another possibility is that the case has been lasered and relapped. Now, this is one of those tricky ones, and different collectors have different feelings on that. When you have a case rebuilt the way I'm describing, they actually add more gold to the case, and then they polish and relap it so that the lines of the watch appear to be original. Some collectors are okay with that. They feel as long as it looks original and feels original, it is original. Some collectors don't feel that way. They want a piece that's honest and true. They want a watch that shows its life. If it has scratches, if it has dings, if it has dents, it honestly shows those. But it represents the history of what it was. That's a personal question. The next conversation is whether or not the watch has been poorly maintained. This is something you want to try to avoid. The rarer the watch, the more forgiving you might be if you're trying to get into an exotic variant or trying to get something that's a little bit of a reach. That said, it's still something to be aware of and make sure that the price accounts for some of these variations. So one of the things that happens is over time, when watches went in for service, even legitimately serviced through Rolex, the cases got polished. And that means as you polish, you're actually taking some of the gold away. Now, that also happened on steel watches, but you have to keep in mind that gold is softer, and so you sometimes see a larger disappearance of metal to bring it back to that new look. That means some of those parts of the case, like below the case, that typically are really sharp, can sort of soften out when they polish them, and that's not really a great thing. Also, some of the people that polish them don't always do a great job. So when you're looking at the case, it's not quite as even, it's not quite as perfect. That can be a problem. Now, when you're looking at it, sometimes it's hard to tell, and sometimes it's easy. So one of the things to do is ask the dealer you're buying it from, and hopefully you're dealing with someone that's honest enough that will be very right and forthright with what they have and what they're selling you. But the other thing to look for is sort of discrepancies. If you notice that the case looks perfect, but the dial has spotting or something that might look like water damage, or you notice that the bezel insert, the aluminum bezel insert, is really scratched, but the case looks beautiful, these are red flags. These mean that the watch has had something done to it. You need to understand that the parts should look consistent. If the case looks worn, and the bezel looks worn, and the dial looks worn, all with a consistent patina, that's a positive sign. If one part looks really worn, and one part looks really new, it's probably been refurbished. So looking for those subtle distinctions when you're looking at the watch are really important. Another thing to look for is that different variants have little tricky elements. So for instance, if you're looking at an early Rolex Submariner with the hollow link bracelet, you'll notice that a lot of those early Submariners don't come with the bracelet anymore. That's for a couple reasons. One, because people have sold the bracelet separately to get more money, or two, because the hollow link bracelets were more fragile. They can tear. They actually can wear in such a way where they need some serious repair. And repairing them can be challenging, and not everybody does it perfectly. That doesn't mean that you don't want these bracelets. It's just another element to be aware of. So what I would say is that if you're interested in buying a solid gold Rolex Submariner, it's a really interesting watch to buy, and you should look at the prices and the variety of watches available. The earliest ones, the tropical dials, the blues, those are going to be more collectible and get significant premiums even over some of the new ones. But if you're going into that middle range, there's a fair amount of value in the Gold Submariner right now because a lot of people are collecting the steel. And that means that since the gold ones haven't gone up as much as the steel ones, you actually have a lot of opportunity to get a wonderful watch. Like they say, collecting and buying gold is not a bad thing. Gold watches are always going to be a wonderful and interesting collectible and something special to own. So it's definitely something that we would say take a look at and enjoy. And feel free to ask us any more questions in the comments below. We'll do our best to answer them. Please feel free to stay tuned for our new content. We'll be putting out more content weekly, and please hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we will be with you again shortly.